I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Annemarie Durbin, is chair at Yorkshire Building Society, Ned at Peters Hill Partners plc, Persimmon Homes and a mentor. Formerly, she was chair at Cater Allen Private Bank, Ned at Santander UK, WH Smith, Ladbrokes Coral Group plc, and Fleming Family and Partners Asset Management, and chair of the UK Listing Authority Advisory Panel at the Financial Conduct Authority. Annemarie's executive roles include country CEO and group company secretary at Standard Chartered Bank. Annemarie, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Oliver. I'm really excited to be spending time with you.
Well, I'd love to start with your experience as a chair. And you joined the Yorkshire Building Society board as a chair designate in 2023. And we've had lots of discussions in the Newroll Plus community recently about CEO succession, but less about chair succession. So perhaps we could start there. And I'm interested to hear how you went about getting yourself comfortable that Yorkshire Building Society was a chair role you wanted to take on.
Well, let me first say that I actually wasn't looking to be a top co-chair. I was happy with the portfolio that I had, and I really thrive on mentoring and coaching. But when the opportunity did come along, which was back in January 2023, the organisation really sang to me. It's a long process, as I'm sure anybody who's, even if you're trying to be an NED, you know this, let alone to be a chair. So there was 7 months of dozens and dozens of conversations, of me doing my due diligence on the sector, because I didn't know the mutual sector, and then on YBS specifically, reading all of the materials that I possibly could, speaking as we got further down the line to knowing that I was going to be the preferred candidate, speaking to former CEOs of YBS, former board directors, the auditors, to really make sure that this was something that both I was suited for from their perspective and that I would be able to be at my best at. And it was something that I really wanted to commit to. So that was a 7-month process. I think the decision was made in July, and then for a variety of reasons, I couldn't join until December. And then I had a 4-month handover with the retiring chair, John Heaps, which was a fantastic and valuable opportunity for me to just listen and learn and observe and get my thoughts together as to what was going to really make a difference. In terms of why YBS, why Yorkshire Building Society, I love organisations with a long heritage. Yorkshire Building Society has been in existence for 160 years as of last year, and that is something that's really to be honoured, and to be part of something where you can hand it over to the next generation fills me with energy. It's simple enough and small enough that you can make a real difference, and yet big enough and systemically important enough that it matters. So that was really important. And as I said before, as a member-owned organisation, that was something I hadn't experienced before. And so that was a great learning for me. And finally, I think the values of the organisation had to align with my own values. The Yorkshire grit and determination, and the Kiwi hard work and pull yourself up by your bootstraps really sang to me. I mean, it's very similar, even though it's completely different parts of the world.
One of the things we think a lot about as a platform is trying to make sure we get that balance of return on time invested right for prospective candidates, figuring out, you don't want to have to invest a load of time if there's no chance of, or very low chance of you getting it. I mean, 7 months is a huge amount of time to invest. How did you get yourself comfortable that that was a good return on your time invested? And for prospective chairs listening to this thinking, gosh, well, what point do I commit as much as that? What advice can you offer?
I think if you don't go whole in to something, then you will always risk regretting that if you'd just done a little bit extra, it would have made the difference. Every conversation I had, whether it was with the first conversation with the SID, whether it was the first fireside chat with the CEO, then with the various individual board directors, and then the panel, et cetera, I became more and more convinced that this was going to be the right place for me. And I can't remember exactly when I decided to really go for it, but it was probably around the Easter period of time where I was I was one of many until after the Easter period, I think. And then I'm not exactly sure what happened, but I think it narrowed down to 2 or 3 after that Easter period through till July, just before the summer break. That's the nature of the game when you're doing a portfolio career. When you're going for an executive role, you really expect that you're going to be successful 90% of the time if you get to a certain level. I've learned over the years, I've been a portfolio non-exec since 2015. And I've learned that actually there's all sorts of factors that lead to whether or not you are chosen as a non-executive director or as a committee chair or indeed as the chair. And not all of those are to do with your competence and experience and the value you bring. So much of it is to do with things that are totally outside of your control. And so I decided that I'd just focus on the things I could control, which was my energy, enthusiasm, passion, dedication, hard work. That is who I am. And I think that came through the interview process.
Well, that's really valuable, I think, for listeners to hear, because I think often people new to the non-executive space, particularly, but even actually seasoned people, forget that. They'll look at a profile like yours and they'll just see the tip of the iceberg and assume you've just breezed it, and they won't sort of understand that behind that there would have been lots of false starts, as you say.
Oh, and even today, if I may say, Oliver, I mean, there are roles in the last 18, 24 months where I put my hat in the ring and that it hasn't worked out. I mean, I used to feel a little bit bruised by each of those experiences, but now I understand better that it's not actually, in most cases, personal. There are just so many other factors. And now that as a chair, I am looking at the board composition and trying to get the best combination of characters around the table, I have an even deeper understanding of that now.
So talk me through, you've done the due diligence on the role and you know you've got it and you're transitioning into the chair role. Sounds like you took on that chair designate role first of all and you were sitting alongside the incumbent chair. For someone listening who hasn't done this before or would like to learn from your experiences, are there any lessons that you've taken about how to move into that chair role successfully? Because you've done it several times now.
There were 2 transitionary periods. The first was from the end of July when I knew that I was going to be there and through to getting regulatory approval in September, I think it was. And then I still hadn't joined the board until December. So there was that sitting on your hands, desperate to get on with it and feeling that's needing to finish off. I was still on the board of Santander and I needed to finish the year off well as REMCO chair at Santander. And then moving to YBS, I had this pent-up desire to get on with things. And actually the learning was that it was hugely valuable to just be able to watch John, watch the board, not have any responsibility at all, and to just observe exactly how things were playing out. And I learned a lot about the dynamics of the board, the dynamics between the exec team and the board. And also there were all sorts of other interesting dynamics going on as it happened during that period. And I had all care, but no actual accountability as chair through that period. I didn't think I was going to embrace that period of time, but if I had my time over again, I would absolutely have a transition period and a handover period similar to that which John and I did.
Now, you mentioned you had a mentor as a chair, which I think is fantastic. I often wonder why more chairs do not have coaches or mentors helping them through it. And we had, I think it was Andrew Kakabatsi in an earlier episode it was episode 50, I think, talking about how the chairs and boards can become like the boiling frog, just part of what's going on because they don't have anything to help them step back. Tell me about how long have you had a mentor for this role and how does it work?
During the course of 2024, last year, I actually was part of the board advisory program, which is a sort of a group of people who are aspiring chairs, and they have a series of engagements with experienced chairs to listen. So that just happened to be happening through this period of time. As I was appointed at the back end of 2023, I then asked for a specific mentor to help me. Although I have been chair of an advisory panel before and chair of subsidiary boards before, is my first top co-chair role, and it is different. And I wanted to be fully enabled to do the best but for the society in my role and to try and avoid as many missteps as I could in that introductory period. And so it was me that asked to have a mentor, and actually it was a former Merrick mentor. So I had a relationship with her from before, and she is an experienced chair herself, and she's somebody I would call a modern chair, which is the sort of model I'm wanting to inculcate.
Can we talk more about your experience then as a board member and how you operate now as a chair? I guess as a board member, you've seen many different chairs operating.
Yeah.
Love to hear who have been the best, and can you bring to life what they did well with tangible examples that listeners might take something from?
Well, it's really interesting because as I take a step back, and now that I am a chair, I have to reflect on these things far more. I think that there are 4 different characteristics that you see in really good chairs. And if I use some real examples of that, we can bring that to life. So one example would be John Kelly. So John Kelly was the chair of Ladbroke Coral when the 2 entities were merged together. And this is a private equity entity being merged with a public listed company. And there was a lot of friction in the boardroom. And what John displayed was absolute calmness under pressure. So he would, both in the boardroom, diffuse tensions, and outside of the boardroom, diffuse tensions, making sure that everybody felt heard and understood. And that was absolutely critical to the successful integration of those 2 entities. If I think of another example, at Standard Chartered, Lord Mervyn Davies, he was amazing when it came to being really clear. He had crystal clarity on what really mattered, and also deep connections, both with all of the board members, but also internally within Standard Chartered. And that came to fore at the time of the great financial crisis, when banks like Standard Chartered were being asked whether or not we would take over failed banks and building societies. And we had to be absolutely crystal clear on the strategy of the organisation, both for the short and the long term, and also ensure that everybody's views were shared in the boardroom. And Mervyn was is a master at doing that. And his successor, Sir John Peace, he brought a different dynamic to the Standard Chartered board. It was quite a big board with more than 15 members around the table. What he brought was unflappability. So he was totally calm. And he is the quintessential conductor of the orchestra. So making sure that each of the members of the board and the management team, that they were playing their roles and sharing their views with a lot of crispness and clarity. And that was really essential in 2012 when the Standard Chartered went through an existential crisis in terms of its US banking license. And he steered the board through those choppy times with that combination of calmness, clarity, and connection with people, and being the conductor of the orchestra.
If we look at the other side of the proverbial balance sheet, the worst examples of chairs that you have been, or chairing you've been exposed to, are there any examples you can share without obviously breaking any confidences?
Well, I've been in a board meeting where the chair has been the only voice in the room, where there's been no time for others to offer their perspectives. And in fact, it was felt I didn't feel comfortable offering a different perspective because I thought that maybe I would be shot down in flames in the boardroom and or would just be sort of underestimated, or that people would just move on and your voice would not be heard. And I've been in a boardroom where there's been two dominant characters in the room and they've actually been WhatsApping each other across the board table whilst theoretically the rest of us are having a conversation. That's hugely dispiriting for a non-executive director. You really want to add value. You really want to make a difference. There's quite narrow frames within which you can do that as a non-executive. And if you feel that you can't even offer an opinion in a safe environment where you're going to feel at least heard, understood, and valued, you do think to yourself, what's the point? If that became a regular pattern of behaviour, definitely I would advocate having a conversation with the chair behind the scenes to just express how you are feeling, to have the courage to do that. And for that, you need to differentiate between chair having a bad day versus this is a real pattern. And I think it's important to give feedback because you don't know whether the individual is aware of his or her behaviour, and you don't know whether that individual has an appetite to learn and grow and change. And if you don't offer the feedback, then they never have the opportunity to learn and grow and change. But it takes courage to give feedback. You've got to know what your next step is going to be in the event that you're not well received in terms of the feedback, and then all of a sudden the mood turns against you as a non-exec. And so you need to know what you're going to do if it doesn't work out.
What have been the most difficult situations you faced as a chair? For someone who doesn't quite understand the challenges of being a chair, can you give us a flavour of the most challenging situations you faced?
I've had a really challenging situation as a subsidiary board chair where I honestly believe that the right thing to do for the organisation is to slow down. This was to do with a replatforming of the customer base for that subsidiary organisation. And we were hurtling forward at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And I really thought this is too risky. It is the entire customer base. So it was only 200,000 customers, but those are 200,000 customers that could have had real challenges if the replatforming had not gone well. And this also was after the TSB situation. And so the latitude that you'd have for a failed replatforming was somewhere near zero. And so it should be, because, it's really important to keep customers safe in terms of being able to transact and do their business. And so having to have that conversation first and formally within the organization's technology and operations area, and then having to escalate that through to the UK subsidiary chair, and then in fact more broadly to the parent, the overseas parent, was something that, I had to think long and hard about, and it was a very difficult thing to do, but it was the right thing to do. And in fact, what I found useful was to position it in a way, and what's in the best interest of the parent, the overall international parent, and reputation is keeping the reputation of the organisation and all its guys is the most important thing. And so how do you put forward your arguments in a way that matters to the overall stakeholders and the parent, and therefore you can be more persuasive rather than just being seen as a nuisance with a small line of business that doesn't really matter in the overall scheme of things.
And was that hard because it was about derailing momentum, or because the executive fundamentally didn't agree with you, or because the non-executive were not aligned?
There was pressure from the parent, and the parent is the shareholder. And aligned to that, there was also a different prioritization of the investment pots that was going on. And the subsidiary I was chair of was a relatively small part of the overall whole. So you tended to feel that you were sort of a pawn in this bigger game, but actually you're a regulated financial services institution with a separate banking license in the UK. And therefore you have a duty, fiduciary duty, as well as a regulatory duty, and as well as a consumer customer duty to do the right thing. And I fervently believe, courage is one of my values. Having the courage to do the right thing, even when it's difficult, is important.
And for those who aren't familiar with subsidiary board roles. Can you perhaps just bring to light some of the differences as you see them for someone who is trying to weigh up, do I try and go for a sort of a main top co or a subsidiary board role?
Not all subsidiaries are the same. So I think if you're going for a subsidiary board role, it's really important in your due diligence to understand what is the level of independence and what is the level of interdependence and overlap, and which bodies do which things. In my experience, things like strategy are often done at the parent level, and at the subsidiary level, you have the degrees of freedom are different, even in terms of resource allocation, in terms of investment pots or capital repatriation. These things, you only have certain degrees of freedom. On the one hand, it's great to have just one shareholder rather than a multitude of them. But on the other hand, that you only have one shareholder, and therefore that's a more difficult thing to manage.
At the start, you said you weren't looking for another topco chair role. Is that because you find those subsidiary roles more engaging? Because it sounds in some ways like you have less control there. Maybe that's the control freak in me coming out.
Yeah, I wasn't looking for any chair role at all. I had a full portfolio. I was happy with what I was doing. One of the things I really love is coaching and mentoring, and it's so easy to squeeze out space. You need to have space and time to do that. And I am determined to make sure that always remains a key part of what I do and how I contribute back to corporate society.
Tell me more about that, because that's interesting. I think that's something lots of Enter the Boardroom listeners are either doing or interested in doing. Why do you want to have that balance between those two roles? And then how do the two roles help one another? Because I imagine there's a lot of symbiosis.
Well, I knew many years ago that I wanted to have a second career that was actually in the coaching and mentoring space. And to their eternal credit, Standard Chartered actually sponsored me in the early 2010s, I think it was, or 2009, to do a master's in executive coaching. So it was a 2 years master's program. My special sauce as a leader was exactly that. I was a real generalist. I had so many different roles in Standard Chartered over the 20 years, mainly business roles, but the last few years were more in functional roles. And so one could say I was a master of nothing and a jack of all trades. But the thing, I was brilliant at leading people, bringing people from very diverse multicultural backgrounds together to aim us all at turning businesses around and to create success at pace. And I love doing it. If you're familiar with the Clifton Strengths, which I happen to be a Clifton Strengths coach, individualization is my number one strength, which means that I get real energy from knowing and getting to know people one-on-one, understanding what their drivers are, what their motivators are, how to get the best out of them, how to enable people to become the best version of themselves. So that really aligns with being a mentor. And actually, being a chair, you have a wonderful opportunity to do that with your CEO. It's different from being a non-executive director. And it's one of the aspects of being a chair that I love deeply, is to be able to have that closer relationship, particularly with the CEO, but also with some other executives around the organization.
But your CEO also has a separate coach. So really interested to understand what's the difference in the coaching that you do as a CEO versus the coaching their coach does?
Well, once again, I think I probably am closer to what the coach would do. The difference is with my CEO, what I say to her, we have a quite deep relationship. And one of the things that I would always advocate to new chairs with their CEOs is to go off site and we spent 2 days together off site at the beginning of our relationship, which is actually something I do with coaching clients as well. But we spent 2 days off site together to really understand each other's strengths and values, to really talk about our roles and responsibilities, to work out how to disagree agreeably, because that's really important to keep the relationship, but to be able to have disagreements about things, and to also talk about strategic priorities and direction and where to push and where not to push. And I think it's 2 or 3 times a year now. It was 3 or 4 times last year, but 2 or 3 times a year we will go off site and do that again, because I think it's so important. The difference between me as a coach and Susan's other mentor is that if she's got a problem with me, she may not talk to me about it. And so she's got somebody who's completely safe and confidential, who will never feed back any of the issues to me. She can work on the feedback that she's got from the board. She can, whatever it is, she can talk to her coach and mentor about. I think the difference with me as in my qualifications and my experience is that she tends to talk to me a lot about that sort of stuff as well. But I trust that she can navigate between the two.
One of the hardest things I found as an independent non-executive compared to my time as an investor director is the lack of a network to support and challenge my thinking in the boardroom. I hope that Enter the Boardroom goes some way to filling that gap. But if you want a more structured, personal space in which to share boardroom challenges and opportunities, I'd recommend our new 12-month NED Mastermind program. Over 6 sessions, you'll meet with a highly accomplished group of 6 to 8 board directors to brainstorm and benchmark boardroom approaches. In each 2-hour session, one member of the group will share their issue or opportunity, for example, how to handle a disengaged CEO. After this, the rest of the group will ask you clarifying questions before offering their ideas. To celebrate our milestone of 100,000 Enter the Boardroom downloads, I'm delighted to offer a 10% discount to all our listeners who sign up between now and the end of March. Head to plus.newroll.com and apply the code ENTER, all lowercase, at checkout. I guess one of the advantages of having qualified as a coach and studied as a coach is it makes you very good at asking questions and being curious. I guess one of the risks is that you might steer away from being more directionary. For a chair listening to this now, wondering whether they should do a coaching qualification to make themselves a better chair, are there pros and cons, or is it, in your mind, just a no-brainer?
I think that the key essence of being a good coach is something that's learnable without needing to go and do a qualification. It's about being really present with the person, really listening deeply with the desire to be curious, to understand where the person is coming from, not just to have your own history and whatever it is, stuff going on in your head. And then to be that ask curious, open-ended questions. I mean, my best question is tell me more, and then just wait and see what happens. And some people are a bit, I'm not talking about my CEO, but in other coaching relationships, sometimes they're a bit uncomfortable about that. And if you can wait in the silence for long enough, then they will tell you more, because most often the thing that comes out of people's mouths straight away is not the full gamut of what they've been, we think far faster than we speak. And so just giving people that space and time to slow down and hear themselves think, and to be able to iterate that thinking is such a gift, such a wonderful gift. And I don't think you have to be qualified to do that, but you do have to be deliberate and to really practice it and to be open to feedback on, well, am I doing this well? There's lots of books you can get, 50 best coaching questions and all these sorts of things. And those are all tips and tricks. But the most important thing is really be there, really listen to understand, and then create the space for the CEO to keep exploring. And this is in the coaching domain, because I think there's two things here. Mentors and coaches are slightly different things. But in the coaching domain, it would be asking questions like, well, in the past, when you've experienced something like this, how did you cope with it? What's worked for you before? What hasn't worked for you before? Who have you spoken to about this? These sorts of, they're all open-ended questions to help the CEO or the executive to think more broadly.
Can we move on to talk about building societies? Because you mentioned at the beginning that this was a new industry and it's not an area I know well. So for a listener who is about to interview or join a building society board, how would you distill the key things that they should understand?
Well, first and foremost, building societies have been around for 250 years now. And I think it's really important to understand the genesis of why did building societies come to be. And it really was small communities, local communities of people who pooled their money, pooled their savings to enable everybody in the pool to be able to buy or build their home. That's the genesis of it. And remarkably, 250 years later, the same genesis really holds true. having said that, there's been a sort of a growth of the building societies over that period of time. And some have remained really true to sticking to their knitting and really small and locally. Others, like Yorkshire Building Society, despite the name Yorkshire, we're a national franchise and actually have nearly 4%, just over 4% of the UK's mortgage market share. So others have grown, and then obviously Nationwide is bigger again, whereas others have just gone into other specialist lending areas. So, but it is important to understand the heritage because that matters to members. That's the next thing, is that every saver, and in many building societies also their mortgage customers, are members. And that means that you were there instead of the shareholder to whom you were returning profits by way of dividend. You are creating value for your members. And in Yorkshire Building Society's case, we provide value to our members through a number of things, including always giving on average above market rates to our savers. So, for instance, in 2023, Yorkshire Building Society gave back to members through interest rates £441 million that they would not otherwise have had through above average rates through the period of that year. And we also invest in local communities, whether it be through branch networks or in local works, and also the sustainability and the community activities like citizens' advice, like financial education. These are not nice to have add-ons. They're a core of who we are and how we operate. And like many building societies, we apply 1% of our profits every year to charitable causes within our local communities that really fit our mission, vision, values, and strategy.
So purpose is clearly a core part of a building society. I was interested researching this, that according to the Building Societies Association, the UK now has 43 building societies and 7 credit unions, but far fewer than there were back in the building society's heyday. Back in 1910, there were 1,723 building societies, and many of those converted into banks. Now, as an outsider, it strikes me that building societies, for some of the reasons you touched on, should have cost advantage versus the banks, and that should give them a strategic winning position. How do you think about that strategic positioning as a board member?
I think the thing to think about is that the plethora, when it was whatever the number is that you quoted just now, they were really small, closed end, and a lot of them closed because its purpose had been fulfilled back in the day. There is, whilst it's true that you can operate a very simple business model at a low cost rate, one of the things that happened with the financial crisis is the significant and needed improvement in regulatory requirements for all financial services organizations to ensure that they really were keeping members' money safe and that were lending responsibly, et cetera, et cetera. And what has happened is that cost to serve means that it's really hard to cover that cost if you're a very small organization. So after the financial crisis, as part of the financial crisis, there was a lot of less stable building societies that were submerged into the banks because the regulators asked for them to be rescued. And that's what led to a lot of the shrinking down to the sort of core 42. And even if you look at the core 42, the big ones, Nationwide is actually a full service provider doing everything for everybody and is arguably as much a bank as any of the others. You then have Coventry that has just announced it's acquiring Co-op, which is actually a remutualizer of a bank into a building society, and Nationwide has remutualized Virgin Money as well. And then there's Yorkshire Building Society, which we started off as Huddersfield Building Society, and then we've acquired other building societies over the years. Though the two are set 60 billion, then the next lot have sort of 20 billion balance sheets. And then there's a lot of small players that are very local and very targeted in what they do.
When you look at the strategic threats for Yorkshire Building Society, what are the things that you worry most about? I think I saw some incredible stat that the average Fortune 500 company now is around for sort of less than 20 years. So for an organization that's been around for 160 years, that there's a big shift going on. And particularly when I look at the macro context with uncertainty around interest rates, changes because of technology and other things, I'm really curious to hear what is top of mind for you.
Yeah, so we're having debates about to what degree does scale matter and what sort of scale, where does that matter? We are, as I say, there's big banks And then there's smaller building societies, and we're sort of in the middle. And so that's an interesting debate to be thinking about. We're really looking at how do we look at our colleagues, making sure that we've got the right talent for not just this generation of savers and borrowers, but also for generations to come. And actually our purpose is a real magnet for talent. People want to join to make a difference, to feel good. Last year, in the first half of last year, we did 23,000 new residential mortgages, and a third of those were to first-time home buyers. The joy you get of enabling somebody to actually move into their first home. And we and many others in the building society sector really focus on that. How do we do that in a way that really has human connection? Many banks talk about, digital bank with a human touch. We want to be a human building society, powered and enabled by technology, systems, processes that are really slick and easy, etc. But the human connection is part of who we are and is really important, both for our members, our customers, our colleagues, and for society as a whole. How to do that and how to transition and do that in a way that's responsible is a key strategic conversation we have. How do you define member value? How we've defined it in the past is relatively narrow. We believe that there's a much more rich and holistic approach to member value that we can offer. And those are discussions that the board are thinking about and talking about actively. And which segments do we play in? How do we make sure that the first and most important thing is to be financially resilient? Our savers have earned their hard-earned cash the hard way, and we are responsible for keeping it safe and helping it to grow, and to do that responsibly now and for the future. So making sure that we're doing that and growing and extending our segments so that we can provide real help for the people who need it most and underserved segments. These are all balancing acts that need to be considered. And actually the board is quite active in a lot of those sorts of things because it's to do with resource allocation in terms of how much do you invest in the future. It's to do with risk appetite, which obviously is a board thing. It's to do with culture. It's to do with values. It's to do with purpose, longevity, financial security and stability. So these are all board issues, and it's brilliant to be able to have real conversations about real things that really matter at the board.
It's lovely listening to you talk because that really shines through how much you care about this stuff. It sounds really personal to you. I'd love to just talk to you about your experience as a company secretary as well, because in past episodes, I've had listeners writing in to ask, why have I never deep dived into the role of the company secretary? Did I have something against it? To which the answer is no, I don't, for the record. And I've seen a range of company secretaries, some very administrative, others incredibly strategic. What's striking to me is that they're mostly prevalent in listed companies and tend to be one of the first cost savings made by private equity investors, which suggests there's a lot of the value linked to that publicly listed ownership. Curious to hear how you see the role of the company secretary, having been one, and the value it brings to the board.
Firstly, although I was company secretary for 8 years, that was part of a portfolio of stuff that included strategy, M&A, crisis management, corporate comms, etc. And before that, I'd been 20 years a banker. So actually, although I qualified as a lawyer, I was no governance expert when I came into the role. But what I was a people expert, and I was a business expert. I really understood the business, and I had around me the most amazingly technically able company secretaries in the team. And I could draw upon them, adding business acumen to their deep technical knowledge. And therefore, I could be a trusted advisor to the chair, which was particularly important when Sir John Peace was chair of Standard Chartered, because he wasn't a banker by background. And it was really helpful to have somebody who understood. I mean, I understood the guts of Standard Chartered inside out, backwards and front, and having lived and worked overseas with them as well. I think it's essential. Not everybody agrees with this. I think it's essential to understand the business and not just at wafer thin level. We really need to understand the strategic and business drivers, the key risks, the key opportunities, as if you were a non-exec. And I think that company secretaries who aspire to sit on boards, that they get to in the boardroom to see non-execs. And I think they need to aspire to behave like a non-exec would, rather than a down and in. You know this better than I do, Oliver. When we look for board roles, I'm looking for somebody with a T profile. They've got the strategic breadth of understanding and a specialism. It can't just be an I with just a specialism without the broad strategic perspective. And so I think you can be that. In fact, I was that as a company secretary, and I think it's really important. The most effective company secretaries are like that. The least effective are just administrative, and actually can be worse than useless, because they actually stop you from doing things because they're so rigid in how the rules are, instead of thinking about, well, what's the purpose of this rule? How do you do that in a commercially viable, regulatory compliant, innovative and useful way?
Just while we're talking about how to go about building your portfolio, it's sometimes said that there are certain board roles which can prove problematic for a portfolio career, and people will often give the sin stock, so sort of gambling and tobacco, weapons, as examples of those roles. You had a board role at Ladbrokes, and was curious to hear whether that's ever been an issue for you with subsequent roles.
First and foremost, I did actually go onto that board with honourable intentions. Although my father was a problem gambler and I never, ever gamble, I'm absolutely violently against gambling. I thought that I could change the industry from inside, and that's also easy to throw stones from the outside. And if you really want to change the world, you've got to lean in to do that. So I joined the board, and actually I joined once again because I had lots of experience of integrating companies, and Ladbrokes, a public listed company, was merging with Coral, a privately owned company, and there was all sorts of things that needed sorting out. But it didn't take me long to realize that when your VIP customers are defined by how much they lose each year with you, that I was not going to be able to change the world from the inside out. And actually, it was just fortunate for me that the company was acquired by another international gambling entity, because I would have had to have stepped down. But it's really interesting because on that board were some amazingly high caliber people with huge value sets on that board. And I learned a lot from them. And actually, it was a great experience in a microcosm. But from an industry-wide perspective, I now realize maybe I just had too much ego thinking I could make a difference. It hasn't, I don't think. Once I've got onto a short list, I've explained it as I've explained it to you, and I've never had a problem with it. It was only 18 months. I mean, for all I know, I get chucked off lots of long lists because of it. I just don't know.
Annemarie, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yep.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, because it's all about self-mastery. If you can master yourself, you know yourself, you can be more effective in a group of people.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
I got a thing about lateness. I really hate lateness. So which is why being late to you today was like going against my own principles. It was deeply hurtful.
I'm so glad I was on time. Most valuable board ritual?
We have a board charter, which is linked to the values of Yorkshire Building Society and especially designed by the board and the ExCo as to how do we want to turn up in the boardroom. We have it out every board meeting and we assess ourselves against it every board meeting. And we don't always live by it, but it's there and it's a reminder of how we want to be with each other. And I think it's actually turning out to be an incredibly valuable tool.
Love that. That echoes the practice of Angela Seymour Jackson, who has the same, I think, at the start of her board pack. So I thought that was brilliant. Favourite quote?
We can't control the things that happen to us, but we can always control our response.
Most significant professional insight?
Most things don't really matter, so let them go. There's a very few things and you need to have the wisdom to know what does really matter and have the courage to pursue that.
Best professional advice you've ever received?
Most things are not as disastrous as you think they are in the moment. So breathe and keep calm and carry on.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I used to think that you could have a wholly effective board that had 15 or more people on it. I don't believe that anymore. It is impossible to have the top level, highly effective board at that size.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
The last time was trusting management too much and for too long on some remediation. And that actually we were trying to be kind and trying to give time, but actually with the benefit of hindsight, we should have called time earlier and said, look, you go back to the drawing board. This is just not working. And actually, I must be a slow learner because that's happened twice now to me. And actually now he's reminded me that there's something I need to go and talk about in the boardroom because I think we may be at risk of that happening again.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I listen more. I'm much more measured in my contribution. I think I must have been a really irritating non-exec when I first came out because I was a serving exec at the same time. W.H. Smith, the CEO there, says I wasn't, but I don't believe him. And I now really hone in on the small number of things that really matter and hold my powder for the rest of it.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
As a non-exec, you have to really understand the specific business that you are on the board of. And particularly if you have industry experience, you have to almost declutter yourself from that and really learn the business that you are serving for that board. That's the first one. Second one is CEO-chair relationship is critical. Make time regularly off-site to invest in that. And the third one is similarly, make space and time, take a step back to reflect on what really matters and the small number of things that really matter because most things don't.
Annemarie, I've learned lots from this. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
No, it's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed it.